Welcome everybody to day 3 of the DANSOX Summer School. That's Dance Scholarship Oxford. I'm Sue Jones, Director of DANSOX, and I'm delighted to welcome for our first lecture this morning, Lucia Camacho Acevedo, who is a PhD candidate at Royal Holloway, University of London. She has particular interests in dance and the links between music, music theory, technology, science, and philosophy. Recently, she contributed an essay to a monograph on the ballet, The Three-Cornered Hat. She's just received an AHLC fellowship to carry out research on Balanchine's Agon and Berg's Lulu at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. She says that she's happiest when watching dance or dancing. So, welcome, Lucia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sue, for the introduction. I've been either watching or attending DANSOX events since I was an undergraduate student, so I'm really, really happy to be speaking at this one today. My talk deviates a bit from the theme of notation. I'm going to be talking about Balanchine's 1957 ballet Agon and about the discipline of choreomusicology and some of its methods. Broadly defined, choreomusicology is the study of music and dance, and more specifically, the relation between music and dance. And it seems to me that in analyzing and writing about ballets such as Agon, choreomusicologists and critics as well usually contemplate the relation between music as a whole and the choreography as a whole, or between some specific musical features and some specific choreographic features. For the most part of the last 2 months, however, what I've been consciously trying to compare is intramusical relationships with intra-choreographic relationships. Because I feel that the way simultaneous phenomena from the same medium relate to each other is itself not only a possible point of analogy, but a productive point of analogy, and one that is perhaps more intuitive that we can imagine. Research in cognition and perception suggests that the ease with which we match sonic events with physical movements is a manifestation of the extent to which complex analogies shape our cognitive processes. And since the 1990s, I think, music theorists like Lawrence Zbikowski have noted that analogy, which is not just a rhetorical figure, but a key cognitive process, as I say, analogy is not simply correlating elements from one domain with elements in another domain, but about mapping relationships between these domains as part of a process of inferential reasoning. So it is thus described, and I'm paraphrasing, as concerned with relations among relations or second-order relations. And one of the reasons why I think this is a good way of looking at Agon in particular is that Stravinsky, who composed the music for Agon, held the notion of chemical reaction as an ideal for multimedia relations. He thought that ballet should be more than the sum of music and dance, that in ballet, a new entity, and I'm quoting, should result from uniting these two different but equally important elements. And for me, the different media in ballet never quite actually pass out of themselves, but I think the principal substance or the principal thing that results from this chemical reaction of music and dance is precisely this process of mapping relationships between both art forms, whether conscious or unconscious. And as I will show a little bit later, the structure of the choreography and the structure of the music in Agon don't always coincide, which means that we ourselves or our minds must move between both art forms or hold them both in duality. So how can we compare intramusical relations with intra-choreographic relations? Well, to begin with, I think the concept of contrapuntal motion from music theory can be used or applied to the analysis of choreography, especially because the idea of motion in music theory, which refers to the imagined movement between two simultaneous musical lines or melodies, this is a highly metaphorical idea that has its source in actual movement in physical space. So like music, dance can very easily be described in terms of parallel motion, contrary motion, or oblique motion. In oblique motion, one of the dancers or one of the musical lines does not move. These are all images, by the way, from the Billy Rose Theatre collection from the New York Public Library, from different productions of Agon. And these are the most basic types of contrapuntal motion in music. And I'm sort of glossing over the definition because I think they're quite intuitive and self-evident. Just in case, my hands are moving right now in contrary motion, in parallel motion right now, and in oblique motion. I hope this is more or less clear. But anyway, contrapuntal motion is not as simple, neither in dance nor in music. Human understanding of physical space is modular and mediated by the body. And even though space is perceived as unitary in general, separate cortical regions actually process kinespheric or peripersonal space on the one hand and extrapersonal space on the other hand. The brain actually maintains a representation of these spaces as separate. This allows for different subtypes of parallel, contrary, and oblique motion. Dancers are capable of stationary movement or of moving without traveling across the stage. Hence, there is more than one center. So in the case of parallel motion, for instance, the dancers might move in the same direction, but they do not have to face the same direction. This is because directionality with respect to the stage, as opposed to personal orientation or possibly motion within the kinesphere, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, seems to preferentially encode the formation of parent levels of motion. Dance provides an excellent platform for studying these questions of perception. But most importantly for me, and I'm not sure there are any music theorists in the audience, but looking at contrapuntal motion in dance leads to a rethinking of traditional contrapuntal motion in music as well. It puts a nuance back into the musical concept that I think opens up new musical understanding. Sound takes place in space, after all, and therefore there are different types of contrapuntal motion available to composers and musicians as well, besides conventional pitch-based motion. Contrary motion can and has been established by composers between moving sound sources, through orchestration, for instance, or by engaging the physical location of musicians on stage. In any case, I think that contrapuntal motion admits levels and degrees, and this has been neglected in music analysis. But all this aside, I am going to turn to the Gaillard from Agon, pardon my French, to demonstrate the usefulness of the concept of contrapuntal motion for choreomusical analysis. The choreography is structured in 3 parts, A, B, and A. And for me, this structure is primarily determined by the type of contrapuntal motion. In the first section, the dance consists almost entirely of contrary motion. This first section is brought to a close by a canon established between the 2 dancers who perform a number of steps in opposite directions. that's the first section. By contrast, the second section is characterized by parallel motion. In previous versions, it is also concluded by an imitative sequence, only this time in parallel motion. But in this production, the choreography at the end varies slightly. And because of the pandemic, I don't have access to any choreographic scores. And these are all publicly available recordings on YouTube. So I have no idea why the choreography changes slightly in the end. But in any case, the second section is still primarily characterized by parallel motion. Finally, the return of the A section is signaled not by the recurrence of particular steps, although some steps reoccur later in this section, but by the return of contrary motion. This might seem obvious, but I think it bears saying. It is not the steps themselves that structure the choreography, but the relationship between these steps. Although, of course, throughout the ballet there are motifs, patterns of movements that reappear. Now, Balanchine does not play up each formal section in the music. Here is a structural scheme of the Gaillard. I can't pronounce that, I'm really sorry. And as you can see, the structure of the music and the structure of the choreography don't quite coincide. There is no change in type of motion at the beginning of the second musical section. The unisons at the end of this musical second section seem to have been the main structural determinant for the choreographer, who seems to not have interpreted the second musical section as such until its repetition. Therefore, while the structure of the music and the structure of the dance do not quite coincide, the latter can be understood as an interpretation of the former, as a way of hearing the music. And I'm going to try to play this movement again, but this time stopping to showcase the divide between the formal sections in the music instead of the dance. That's the end of the first musical section. The next thing that's going to happen is a new musical section. And then again, this second musical section is repeated. And I'm going to stop it right there because after that, the structures of the music and the dance do coincide. Contrapuntal motion plays a major structural role in most dances of this ballet, though it does not always suggest an understanding of choreographic and musical form as two separate things. I'm just going to offer one more example of this, which is perhaps slightly less apparent. The initial dance in Agon, the Pas de Quatre, is a musical rondo. It has 3 sections, which I've labeled A, B, and C, which are, with the A section itself consisting of 2 subsections, A1 and A2. As is common in rondos, the A and B sections are restated several times. None of these formal cells is repeated exactly, but it is quite easy to distinguish between them because they each are distinguished by separate harmonic areas, separate motifs, and also by separate musical textures. This movement is choreographed for 4 dancers, and a key change in the grouping of the dancers always takes place during the A2 sections. I apologize about the low quality of the images. These are screenshots because, again, I do not have access to archives. The four dancers move in parallel and hence perceptibly form one group in the first A2 section, bars 7 to 9. In the second section, Balanchine deploys contrary motion for the first time, and this divides the dancers into two equal groups. In the third A2 section, the dancers perform the exact same step, but each face a different direction, and they perform it in contrary motion. Therefore, they each read as four separate individuals rather than as a group. Finally, in the last A2 section, the choreography brings back two equal groups of dancers, although this time they're facing each other within those groups. There are many of this sort of pattern or recurrent relation in Agon. These relations have been overlooked so far in choreomusical analysis, but I believe they have structural significance, or at least play a role in our experience of multimedia works. Agon is one of the most written about ballets. Perhaps someone might correct me in the audience, but I think it's possibly the most written about leotard ballet by Balanchine. And in fact, the title of my talk alludes to a much quoted essay from 1993 by world-renowned scholar Stephanie Jordan. Jordan writes about the pas de deux, which is the climax and perhaps the most famous dance in Agon, among other things. She addresses the question of how and why this movement is different from the rest of the ballet. Often, but not always, Stravinsky and Balanchine fix timings with great precision. But in the pas de deux, timing of the choreography and the choreography itself vary the most between productions in comparison with all the other dances. Hence, out of all the movements in Agon, this is the one that plays the most on the contradictions inherent in a certain conception of choreography, or a certain ontology of the work of art as fixed and fixable, as an unstable thing. Watching the publicly available recordings of Agon, it becomes apparent to me that the dancers are the least disciplined by the music in this section. They have the most flexibility as regards timing. And something that might be interesting to note and discuss is that as the years go on, the choreography is increasingly performed so that the steps seem to imitate or mirror the music. There are more moments of connection between the music and the dance. I would like to suggest that this might be because it might be easier to remember choreography if the similarities between the choreography and the music are more obvious. But perhaps this is also because flexibility of timing or of anything else does not quite fit in with ideas of genius, and therefore is not encouraged by rehearsal directors. In any case, Jordan addresses two other characteristics that separate the pas de deux from the rest of Agon: tempo and, I quote, breath rhythm. The outer sections of the pas de deux, which are called the Adagio and the doppio lento, are the slowest in the entire ballet. Breath rhythm concerns the structure of the choreography, and I quote from Jordan, the long sustained lines of intertwining and stretching motion. The lines are peppered with staccato gestures, but these do not override the main legato approach. Arthur Mitchell referred to the Adagio as one long, 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 long breath. One long, 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 long breath is, of course, not the actual respiratory rate, not the dancers anyway, although we as an audience might be inclined to hold our breath. Still, I feel that the major contrast in style between the pas de deux and the rest of the dances in Agon has been overlooked so far. For me, it lies not so much in the tempo or in the sense of continuity, but in the special choreographic relation between the two dances, as well as between the musical constituents. In the rest of the ballet, the choreography can almost always be described in terms of parallel contrary motion. The dancers clearly face cardinal or diagonal directions for the most part of the ballet. This is not the case in the pas de deux. Here the couple constantly rely on each other, enabling, anchoring, or directing each other's movements. The steps they each perform are seldom self-contained. except during their solos. They move less across the stage, and in comparison with the other dances in Agon, only this one presents a dancer crossing over another dancer or crossing in front of another dancer whilst moving in parallel motion. And I'm going to play the Adagio. Relatively recent version. I think these are Mel Tomlinson and Heather Watts in 1983. So in this version, there's even more use of parallel contramotion, and I think the way it's filmed makes it seem like they face more diagonal directions than in the early versions. In any case, the dances seem incomplete without one another. Running through the pas de deux is there a struggle to assimilate, almost like parts of a machine. Meanwhile, the musical texture plays an ambiguity. Elsewhere in the ballet, musical elements can be passed into a precise number of musical lines, or parts, or melodies. But here the music sits between singleness and multiplicity, and this condition is exclusive to the outer sections of the pas de deux. Disjunct intervals impede the perception of the notes as one continuous stream. Stravinsky's instrumentation and use of articulation marks reinforce this ambiguity. The different instruments are at times indistinguishable or seem to switch identities. The parts share a similar register and some pitch content, and they lack rhythmic distinctiveness at times. So as I say, it's difficult to parse the sounds in distinguishable lines. Previous dance analyses have stressed the similarities between the outer sections of the pas de deux, the Adagio and the doppio lento. But some things change in the course of the pas de deux. The choreography affects a transformation or a process. It progresses from generating tension to generating tenderness. In the doppio lento, the couple's poses, I don't know if that's the right word, but the couple's poses are easier to achieve. Their steps are less challenging. This change is perhaps best exemplified by a comparison between two poses, one from the Adagio and one from the doppio lento, or to use images from the same production, this one. In the first pose, the female dancer is in point, thus relying much more heavily on the male dancer for support. These added difficulties sidle away in the doppio lento at the end of the pas de deux. Overall, the scene no longer showcases athletic prowess as much as the couple literally bent on becoming one. And I think this story arc is resolved in the final sequence of poses. This is all the more poignant because, unlike at the beginning of the pas de deux, they never look at each other's faces or into each other's eyes. Nor do they look at the audience, which I feel is the more common alternative in traditional pas de deux. Instead, they look at parts of their body, frequently the ones that are moving as if on their own. I think this is the doppio lento at the end of the pas de deux.
Zum Erfolg geführt. Er selbst stammt aus Russland und wurde in Petersburg ausgebildet. Seine historische Leistung besteht darin, das klassische Schritt- und Bewegungsrepertoire für die Vereinigten Staaten im 20. Jahrhundert weiterentwickelt zu haben. Das Ergebnis ist ein Tanz von großer Klarheit und Kraft.
I think this is the only time in which the male and female dancers look at each other's faces during the Adagio in the earlier versions, although I'm not sure they are quite looking at each other's eyes. This gaze is also observed in later productions, and in these later productions, the different couples do briefly share several glances during the Adagio, the first part of the pas de deux. Yet there is no staring into each other's eyes during the doppio lento. So I think to sum up, what separates the pas de deux is not a question of different dance steps or different musical motifs, but of a radically contrasting use of space and unprecedented types of interaction between the dancers, the peculiar mix of lack of individuality and singleness of purpose. And I've got two more points I'd like to make before concluding this presentation. First, I'm very intrigued about what it is that people mean when they talk about a counterpoint between the music and the dance. This is something that I'm currently writing about in my thesis because I'm very interested in the concepts of counterpoint and musical texture. And there are references aplenty to a counterpoint between the music and the dance in ballets by Balanchine and Stravinsky. This expression in general has in fact been used over and over again since the 1910s. This is Robert Kraft, for instance. The Stravinsky-Nijinsky choreography of The Rite of Spring outlines a strictly musical approach to the ballet, contrapuntal in movement and in phrasing, and with no attempt at imitating or matching the images of the orchestra. I think there's a typo there, but whatever. Balanchine scholars such as Charles Joseph often use this term in a literary, non-technical way. Joseph states, for instance, that Balanchine wanted to explore all types of counterpoints, male and female, spatial, rhythmic, and most broadly, audiovisual symmetries. I think these uses of the word tend to convey an almost binary understanding of counterpoint as a meeting of purported contraries. Audiovisual, male, female. And although this might make sense from an etymological point of view, actual musical counterpoint is far richer and more sophisticated. I'm not sure there's time to go into the question of what counterpoint is in music, because that's a very complex issue. Maybe we can talk about it later. But I think it's worth noticing that in dance discourse, the word is often used to refer to several types of music-dance relationships, and that these types of relationships are actually quite varied and different. Counterpoint is used to refer, for instance, to the use of imitative entries, both in music and in dance. But sometimes counterpoint alludes to what could be called, or has been called by some scholars, as complementation. Jordan herself highlights several instances of complementation in her essay. For instance, the pulse choreographic ending of the Gaillard is memorable. Two women perform a set of 9 gestures to a sustained chord. The dancers, as Jordan notes, seem to be complementing or filling in the music. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think it's interesting to note that the more complex the music, the less likely it is for the choreography to be perceived as complementary, or vice versa. When occurring on the basis of rhythm, complementation hinges upon ambiguity. That is, meter or rhythmic patterns must be ambiguous or unstressed in the music for steps and gestures to articulate them. Other times, however, counterpoint expresses dissociation or contest. And I don't mean just a sense of competition between the music and the dance, but a relationship in which the constituent elements, in the case of different media, do not quite coexist within the same framework. Jordan again. Balanchine often achieves rhythmic tension by counterpointing dance events and accents against those in the music, especially when he introduces a different meter from that of the music. In this example, the metrical framework of the dance and the metrical framework of the music are not compatible. They each contradict one another. And I would argue that it is actually more difficult to find instances of this in Agon, merely because within the music itself, there's already use of multiple meters. Lastly, much has been made of the fact that agon comes from the Greek and means contest, competition, or struggle. And without dismissing all the excellent work on agon by other scholars, I would like to add that the word is not merely a synonym for these things. Other meanings of the word include game and debate, and it also alludes to the arena or gathering space in which these events are held. This mixture of concept, quarrel, play, athletics, rhetorics, is woven into Balanchine's agon. One essential characteristic of the agon is an emphasis on the event of the assembly or the festival itself. The agon is not necessarily outcome-oriented, hence that the dances in agon are not victory-driven, something that I feel is neglected in commentaries of agon. These games are unwinnable. The dancers in agon rarely confront each other. Instead, they mostly stand side by side, or they support one another. I can't remember where I saw this quote, but I think when he first floated the idea for the ballet, Lincoln Kirstein originally requested a competition before the gods. And this suggests a display of skill, of a spectacle for the sake of spectacle. In this context, the pas de deux can perhaps be understood as a digression from the main event of the competition, because although the dancers seem intent on achieving something, synchronicity or unity perhaps, they don't seem to be doing it for the audience. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Sorry, it took me a while to get this microphone on. I think there's going to be a number of questions generated by your very interesting talk here. I just want to say before I forget that I talked to Heather Watts about this, this particular ballet in New York, and she emphasized, she was talking about the pas de deux as a moment of not simply of struggle and conflict, as in the Agon, but also of a confrontation with the audience, because she said she made a big thing about that, the original turn with Arthur Mitchell into the attitude, and that moment of whoosh, confront the audience. So Balanchine is in some way bringing the audience very specifically into relation with whatever struggle. And I mean, there are also sorts of problems to talk about with the use of a black dancer and a white dancer. I mean, there's been a lot written about that. What's Balanchine doing here? So I'm just going to hand it over to everyone else, because I just wanted to say that, because I was surprised. Is that Heather on the? That's not Heather on the. No.
I'm only using what I can see. So
does it say it's actually Heather dancing there? Because it didn't look. Heather was much spikier when she did the.
Yeah.
You know, into the
I don't
attitude.
know. I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting. Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about that. Okay, who would like to ask questions? I'm sure you've got loads of remarks. Susie, did you have anything to?
Thank you. It's always such a pleasure to consider this ballet. I think so. It's so interesting, and it's really appreciated that. I'm just thinking about the pas de deux. That what strikes me. What strikes me is that it's less about rhythm and more about. It sounds like recitative and a conversation. In a way that the other section is clearly a dance form, and that gives it a completely different sort of phrasing.
Yes, Susie. Heather actually used the word conversation when she was talking about the pas de deux.
Yes, and I think that's really interesting what you said about their focus not being either the audience or, in actual fact, each other's own eye contact, but being about the body. And I think that makes it very interesting in that they are. It's a kind of communication, very much between them, but that is not about. That's about the communication of the body, really.
Yeah, I think even if as Sue said, even if they somewhat antagonize the audience in some productions, this is radically different from what we have seen until now in the ballet, in that before we have seen the dancers presenting their skills to the audience, for the audience. So this is what makes, I think, this dance so climactic, really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. It's really, as to echo Susie, really wonderful to consider this ballet. And I'm just thinking about the Galliard. It's a piece I know quite well because I've studied it with various groups of students, just because it uses such basic technical vocabulary, but in a kind of spiky way. And just to say there's an interesting repetition of step in the two Bs that you pointed out. So I was intrigued by that. But is the pas de deux a saraband is that the original dance that, because Stravinsky is using old dance forms and reinventing them. So and does that give us some insight also into what's going on in the pas de deux if it is a sarabande?
I don't think it's strictly a sarabande. There's another sarabande in Agon, which is for a choreographed for a male dancer. It's a solo, but I do think it has musical influences from Baroque dances. Stravinsky uses a mandolin, for instance, which I feel has certain Baroque connotations.
So what is the dance? Is there a particular dance form that is being drawn on for the pas de deux?
I don't think so. This was composed at a different time as well from the rest of the dances in Agon, and it is often commented upon that he uses much more atonal influences in the pas de deux. But I might be wrong. I'm not 100% sure.
So that's already that makes it an interesting distinction, and we move into much more fluid and a rhythmic territory in terms of the movement and steps.
Yeah, even though he does use tone rows before in the ballet, so serialism or atonality is not exclusive to the pas de deux, which I think is an interesting thing to note.
Anyone else? Oh, Marcus.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your brilliant paper, and thank you for laying out all of the complex ways that music and choreography are relating to each other. I was really struck when you said that music also has this kind of spatial relationship, and I was wondering if there's a kind of a difference in the effective counterpoint, whether there's, maybe this is a really basic question, whether there's kind of a live orchestra playing with this piece, or it's a recording, or if that differs in the other productions.
Yeah, I think Stravinsky certainly thinks about the location of the orchestral musicians on stage when he's composing, and in most dances in Agon, I feel that if you hear it live, you can really distinguish between the different sound sources, except in the pas de deux, where I feel the sonorities sort of become a little bit confused with one another. So yeah, the answer is yes. It's also interesting to note that something like contrapuntal motion, using actual physical space in music, is trickier than visual contrapuntal motion, just because our ability to locate sound is perhaps not as good as our ability to visualize the source of sound, the source of movement. Sorry, but I think this adds to that issue of balance, and how if there are a lot of these different complex relationships in the music, often I feel that Balanchine doesn't add more complexity. I feel like, people might have different interpretations, but I think that Balanchine tends to simplify his relationships in his choreography whenever the music uses particularly complex contrapuntal relations.
Lucia, I was just wondering, does the Balanchine Foundation allow this ballet to be performed with recorded music? Because most of the companies that are likely to be given permission to do this are probably working with live orchestra. So I just wondered if it's...
Well, do you mean by companies other than the New York City Ballet?
Sorry, yeah.
Do you mean by companies other than the New York City Ballet?
Yeah.
Then I'd say probably not, but I don't know.
Yeah, because when it's been done done by the Royal Ballets always have live music, and I just wonder if there are any companies who do it with recorded music.
I seem to remember a recording of a Balanchine festival in Canada, which I think was played to live music, but I think this was New York City Ballet as well. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm still trying to get in touch with them to have some clips in my dissertation. So.
Inevitably, I mean, it is, if that kind of spatial counterpoint is integral to the experience of it, we're never going to get it on the screen, are we? Because
absolutely.
we'll be missing that dimension of it.
And it's very difficult to actually play Stravinsky on the sound speakers, just because, as we said before, the nature of his music is so specialized already, that if he plays 2 sound sources or however many sound sources in a hall, is not gonna quite, however sophisticated those audio systems are, is not gonna quite compare to the experience of hearing it live.
Just to say that I danced with Ataballetto in 1982. We did Agon, and we did do it with recorded music on tour. So in East Germany, I think that was a long time ago. Mm-hmm. But, I've got a question about. I think. Can you talk a little bit more about what's going on in the brain with the exterior and the interior cognitive? You mentioned something about cognition and interior and exterior space. Was that the exterior space to the body? And could you just talk a bit more about that and what the cognitive implications are about that for the dance?
Well, I would like to say that I am not a scientist, so I'm not going to put my hand in the fire and say that our brain works in such or such way, because I actually don't know. But what I do know is that choreographers like Balanchine use a lot of symmetries in their choreography, and when we analyze these symmetries, we very quickly realize that things can be symmetrical with regards to a number of centers. And this is because, as I said in my presentation, our brain has the actually separate cortical regions, is what I know, in our brain process what Rudolf Laban called the kinesphere, our personal space, and extrapersonal space. And I think the stage as a space lies between those two things. And so when a dancer moves, he can move with respect to himself, with respect to another dancer, and with respect to the space that is the stage. And so in terms of parallel and contrary motion, there are many possibilities. A dancer himself or herself might move in parallel motion just by using different parts of their body. But 2 dancers can also move in parallel or contrary motion. So yeah, I just think the way we perceive space is actually much more complex than we realize sometimes, and choreographers have exploited this in very interesting ways.
That brings us, Jennifer, to another point I was thinking about, Lucia. In your actual analysis, to what degree do you take into account the kind of phenomenological experience of the dancer and the fact that, as we were talking at the very beginning, you get very individual performances of particular movements. So how does that affect your actual process of analyzing?
Mm-hmm. Well, all of this is a work in progress. So what I think I'm going to try to do is just refer to the specific recordings I have access to. But of course, as we have said before, I don't even have information regarding those recordings. So I'm not even sure even from what year these recordings date, or the actual names of the dancers. So,
so you're not sort of bound to be looking for authorial intention or choreographic intention on the point of Balanchine.
Not
I
necessarily.
mean, are you bringing that kind of questioning into the analysis?
In the sense that I'm noticing the things that all of these have in common. Yes.
That's really helpful, actually.
Yeah. But I do not necessarily assume that Balanchine intends things, because I actually don't know. But I think we can all observe. Yeah. But we can all observe things that these recordings have in common and question why.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think that really helps us to kind of nuance the whole process. Yeah.
It would be a little bit better if, again, I had some information regarding these recordings. But
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Any more questions here? Is there anyone upstairs? No. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you so much for getting us going this morning, Lucia.
Thank you so much.
And I think it actually, it really contributes very well to the whole question that we've been asking about, how do we record? How do we, and what constitutes notation in this? That's the one question we haven't asked, is do you use notation at all in your analysis?
Musical notation all the time, yeah.
Wow, interesting. But not dance notation.
Just because I don't have access to it.
Right, yeah.
But I would love to.
I'm just wondering how that would affect the mix of it all.
Especially because I have so many questions regarding changes in choreography between productions. And some of them are very significant, and some of them I can find a reason for them. But for instance, the changes in the Gailliard, I have no idea of why they decided to change the choreography there. And one production supports my interpretation of the dance more than the other. So.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Lucia. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.